before the auctioneer's gavel could fall, and with it, seal the fate of a traumatized war dog going to a private security contractor for $12,000. A 26-year-old woman named Joelle Picard raised a crumpled $50 bill above her head. What happened in the next 4 minutes silenced a hangar full of hardened soldiers, caused a colonel to forget his composure for the first time in 2 decades of service, and made every single military working dog inside Hangar 3 at CFB Trenton turn, in absolute eerie unison, toward the woman standing alone on the auction floor in her dead father's oversized field jacket. The Trent River Valley in late November carried a particular kind of cold that settled into the bones rather than landed on the skin. It was the gray, resigned chill that Joelle knew from childhood, from growing up in Pembroke, Ontario, a small city that measured its identity in proximity to Garrison Petawawa and the steady parade of Canadian Forces trucks that rolled down Pembroke Street on their way to somewhere more dangerous than home. Joelle Cecile Picard was 26 years old and worked as a registered veterinary technician at a small animal clinic on the edge of town. She was not particularly tall, not particularly loud, and she had the kind of quietness about her that people sometimes mistook for shyness until they sat next to her long enough to understand it was actually precision. She did not waste words. Her father had been the same way. Warrant Officer Marc Picard had served 18 years with the 2nd Battalion, Royal Canadian Regiment, before being attached to a joint task force training unit that deployed to Mali in early 2022. He was a compact, composed man with the patient eyes of someone who had learned long ago that the world rewards stillness more than noise. In 18 years of service, he had never once failed to come home to Joelle. He had missed school plays and figure skating competitions and her university convocation, but he had always, eventually, come through the front door of their house in Pembroke, smelling of diesel fuel and military soap, and that had always been enough. For 4 of those 18 years, Marc had not deployed alone. Arrow was a Belgian Malinois, 78 pounds of engineered instinct muscle, and something that approached genius in the discipline of explosive detection. He had a deep mahogany coat with a black mask that made him look perpetually focused, perpetually evaluating. He was dual-purpose certified, trailing and patrol, and his training file noted, in the careful bureaucratic language of military performance reviews, that he had exceptional handler bonding characteristics. What that meant, in plain terms, was that Arrow and Marc Picard had fused into something that functioned as a single organism. Arrow knew when Marc was tired before Marc did. Marc knew Arrow's injury bark from his alert bark, the way a parent knows the difference between a child's cries. Joelle had met Arrow twice during Marc's stateside leave periods. Both times, the dog had placed his heavy head on her knee without being invited, and then simply stayed there, warm and unmoving, for as long as she allowed it. She had thought at the time that he was simply a calm, well-adjusted animal. She understood now that he had been reading her, cataloguing her scent, her cadence, the particular rhythm of her breathing, the way he catalogued everything within his radius. He had been filing her away. He had been making room for her. The mortar strike in Mali came on a cloudless Tuesday morning in March. Marc's patrol had been conducting a route clearance in the Menaka region. Arrow had flagged a pressure point 17 meters off the road. As Marc moved his team back to establish a safety cordon, a secondary device detonated from an unexpected azimuth. It wasn't the one Arrow had found. It was the one no one had found. Marc Picard was killed instantly. He was the only fatality. The military casualty assistance officer arrived at Joelle's door in Pembroke at 9:17 that evening. She knew before she opened it. She had known the precise moment it happened. She would tell people later, though she could never fully account for how. Some bonds don't respect geography. Arrow survived. He sustained lacerations to his right flank, and a severe contusion to his front left paw, requiring 4 weeks of surgical recovery at the Canadian Forces Base Veterinary Services facility at CFB Borden. But the physical damage was the lesser wound by far. Arrow had been there when Marc died. He had tried to reach him. It had taken 2 handlers and a sedation injection to get the dog into the evacuation vehicle. According to the field medical report, one of the few documents Joelle was given access to, Arrow had howled for 40 minutes without stopping, a sound the attending medic described in his notes as unlike any vocalization I have encountered in 8 years of K9 field support. The Belgian Malinois that returned from Mali was not the dog Marc had deployed with. He refused food intermittently for days at a time. He redirected aggressively on unfamiliar handlers, once badly enough that a kennel master required 4 stitches on his forearm. He shredded 3 sleeping mats in a single night. When a vehicle backfired near the Borden facility, Arrow launched himself headfirst into the chain link of his enclosure with enough force to bloody his own muzzle. The base veterinary psychologist classified him as exhibiting severe PTSD-adjacent behavioral dysregulation. The phrase danger to civilians appeared in the official assessment with the same clinical neutrality one might use to note that a vehicle needed an oil change. Joelle had filed the adoption application the week the report landed in her email inbox. She was a registered vet tech. She had professional experience with high-anxiety animals. She had a home with a yard on a quiet street in a town she had never once thought of leaving. She had known this specific dog, and this specific dog had known her. The application was denied in 6 weeks. The Department of National Defense's position, communicated through a formal letter signed by a name she did not recognize, was that Arrow's behavior classification made him an unsuitable placement in a civilian domestic environment, and that his specialized training represented a significant asset investment warranting disposition through approved surplused channel protocols. In plain English, they were going to sell him. Joelle read the letter standing at her kitchen counter. She set it down, went to her bedroom closet, and took out the field jacket. Marc had left it on his last visit home, 6 months before the deployment. It was the faded olive-drab combat jacket he wore during domestic training exercises, not his issued kit, but the one he put on around the house and on weekend runs along the Ottawa River. It still smelled like him. Cedar, gun oil, the particular unscented soap the military recommended, and Marc had used for so long it had become indistinguishable from his own skin. She checked the left breast pocket. The $50 bill was still there, folded in 3. Her father had pressed it into her hand the last morning she'd driven him to the base before his departure flight. "Keep this," he'd said, in the same low, even tone he used for everything from grocery lists to mission briefings. For when you genuinely need it, a Picard always keeps something in reserve. She unfolded it, looked at it for a moment, put it back. She was going to that auction. Hangar 3 at CFB Trenton was a steel-ribbed, fluorescent-lit cavity that smelled of hydraulic fluid, cold concrete, and institutional coffee. On this particular December morning, it housed 3 rows of surplus tactical vehicles, 2 pallets of decommissioned communications equipment, and along the far north wall, 12 reinforced transport kennels. The collective noise of the dogs inside them was a wall of sound, barking, pacing, the rhythmic clang of cage doors being tested by animals that wanted out. The crowd was male in its majority and professional in its posture. There were municipal police procurement representatives in department legal fleeces. There were 2 officials from a Saskatchewan-based private corrections contractor who had driven overnight, and at the front of the room, close to the auctioneer's podium, stood a man named Hugh Taggart. Taggart was the Eastern Canada Regional Director of Meridian Group, a private security firm holding contracts with several federal crown corporations, 3 embassy compounds in Ottawa, and a corporate campus in Calgary. He wore a charcoal blazer over a black tactical turtleneck and held a paper coffee cup with the logo of a chain that had briefly attempted to rebrand itself as upmarket. He surveyed the lots with the evaluative patience of someone shopping for office furniture. He was waiting for Lot 7. Joelle had driven herself to Trenton at 5 in the morning, arriving at the base gate before the early sun had cleared the tree line east of the bay. She had worn the jacket. She had told her mother she had an early shift. She stood near the back of the hangar, her arms crossed inside the jacket's oversized sleeves, watching the early lots process through. A decommissioned light utility vehicle, a pallet of tactical radio equipment, while a civilian auctioneer named Don Price ran the proceedings from a portable wooden podium with the efficient, uninflected cadence of a man who had been doing this for 30 years. Moving along to the K9 assets, Price announced, adjusting the microphone. Lot 7, Belgian Malinois, male, 8 years, dual-purpose explosive detection and patrol certified, previously assigned to Joint Task Force Support Operations. The animal sustained a combat-related injury to the left forepaw, now fully healed. Current behavioral classification is elevated aggression. He is not a pet. He is a certified military working dog asset, and he requires experienced handling and an extensive reintegration protocol. Bidding opens at $2,000. 2 kennel masters came through the rear door. They were not walking Arrow in. They were managing him, dual titanium catch poles attached to a reinforced harness, their feet braced, their movements tightly coordinated. Even so, Arrow was dragging them slightly forward with every surge of his compact, furious body. He was muzzled. It didn't matter. The sound that came through the leather and mesh was a continuous guttural frequency that cut under the ambient noise of the hangar and landed somewhere in the chest cavity. His dark eyes swept the room in rapid, tactical arcs. His claws scraped against polished concrete and threw small sparks. The crowd, which had been murmuring steadily, went instinctively quiet in the way people do when they encounter something genuinely dangerous. Joelle saw him and stopped breathing for a moment. He was nothing like the dog who had rested his head on her knee. He was nothing like the photographs Marc had sent. Arrow mid-leap over a training hurdle, Arrow napping in a forward operating base with his chin on Marc's boot. This animal was a wound that had not been dressed. This was grief wearing fur and muscle, and it was terrible to look at and impossible to look away from. 2,000, Price called. Do I have 2,000? A corrections official raised a placard. Taggart glanced up from his phone. 3,000. Arrow lunged. One of the kennel masters was pulled forward a full step, his boot skidding on the polished floor. Someone in the crowd took a reflexive step back. 3-5, the corrections rep countered. 5, Taggart said flatly, not looking up from his phone again. He'd dealt with difficult animals before. He had facilities and personnel for exactly this. Joelle pushed away from the wall. She was not tall enough to be visible in the crowd, and not loud enough to be noticed by the people she was easing past. She slipped between a procurement rep and a municipal officer, ducked under the yellow security tape separating the spectator area from the auction floor, and walked down the center aisle. The first person to notice was one of the kennel masters, who shouted for her to clear the floor immediately. Arrow reacted to the sharp command by talking sideways, and the handler's attention snapped back to the dog. By the time anyone else moved to intercept Joelle, she was already standing 11 feet from Arrow in the middle of the auction floor, holding a folded $50 bill in the air. The hangar went quiet in the way that large spaces do when something impossible is happening, in pieces, as people notice and stop talking, and the silence spreads outward until it reaches the walls and has nowhere left to go. Don Price lowered his gavel. He did not speak. Taggart turned. His expression was not cruel. It was simply uncomprehending the way a practiced professional looks when a situation departs so completely from all known protocols that the mind briefly stalls. "Is this a joke?" he said, quietly enough that it barely carried over the ambient hum of the fluorescent lights. Joelle did not look at Taggart. She did not look at Price. She did not look at the dozen men who had stopped moving and were staring at her with the collective expression of people who could not decide whether to intervene or keep watching. She looked at Arrow. He was still straining against the catchpoles, but his attention had split. His ears, pinned flat against his skull in full defensive aggression, were twitching now, one forward, one sideways, recalibrating. His nose was working in long, deliberate pulls. "I bid $50, Joelle said. Her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. "He's not an asset. He's Warrant Officer Marc Picard's partner. He was with my father when my father died, and he has nobody left, and I am not leaving here without him." The moment she said the name, Marc Picard, Arrow stopped. Not slowed, not hesitated, stopped. The catchpoles went slack simultaneously. Both kennel masters stumbled forward half a step, with the sudden absence of resistance. Arrow had planted all four paws flat on the concrete. His snarling ceased so completely that the silence where it had been was its own kind of sound. His nose was working furiously now. He was reading the air in long, controlled sweeps, the cedar, the gun oil, the particular unscented soap that had become indistinguishable from the skin of a man who was no longer in the world, but was still faintly, impossibly, present in the fibers of an old field jacket. Arrow made a sound. It was not a bark. It was not a growl. It was a high, fractured frequency, something between a whimper and a keen, that seemed too vast to have come from a dog and too raw to have come from anything trained. It came from somewhere prior to training. It came from whatever lives in an animal that remembers and grieves and cannot express it in any language available to it. He lowered himself. Not to a sit, not to a down command. He dropped his belly to the concrete in the slow, deliberate way of an animal, making itself as small and unthreatening as possible, the absolute inversion of everything he had been doing for the past 9 months. His heavy, muzzled head came down to the floor, and then he began to crawl. Slowly on his belly, across the cold concrete, toward Joelle. The two kennel masters looked at each other and said nothing. And then, from the far north wall of Hangar 3, the barking stopped. Not tapered off. Stopped. All 12 of the kennelled dogs. The Belgian Malinois, the Dutch shepherds, the Labradors, the 2 German shepherds. They stopped simultaneously, as though a signal had been transmitted on a frequency the humans in the room were simply not equipped to receive. One by one, in a wave that moved from the nearest kennel to the farthest, each dog turned. They did not lie down. They sat up perfectly straight, ears at full attention, chests square, facing the center aisle, facing Joelle, all 12 of them, motionless, silent. The posture of a unit reporting for duty. The silence in Hangar 3 was of a quality that Joelle had only encountered once before, at her father's funeral, in those particular seconds after the rifles fired and before the sound finished rolling away across the cemetery. The silence of something being honored, not observed, honored. Hugh Taggart's coffee cup was at a tilt in his hand that suggested it had been there for some time without him noticing. Don Price had set his gavel on the podium's surface and appeared to have forgotten it existed. The sharp double click of boots on concrete broke it. Colonel Brian Sutton had been observing the proceedings from the east side of the room, which was standard practice for disposal events involving classified training assets. He was a tall man in his early 50s, with the kind of posture that had been structural for so long he no longer had to think about it. He crossed the auction floor with the measured purpose of a man who has identified a problem and intends to resolve it. "Suspend the bidding," he said to Price. His voice carried the smooth, absolute authority of someone accustomed to being the last word in any room. Colonel Price said carefully. "The bid is active. I have a standing offer at $5,000 from Meridian Group. I cannot legally suspend an active bid without a formal directive issued in advance." Sutton's jaw tightened. He looked at Joelle, who was now kneeling on the oil-stained floor with both arms around Arrow's thick neck, her face pressed into the fur at his collar, crying quietly and steadily. Arrow had his muzzled face buried in the jacket at her sternum. He was not moving. He did not appear to intend to move. "This animal was classified dangerous 2 months ago," Sutton said, his voice carrying the edge of a man who knows he is losing the argument, but has not yet found the framing to win it. "What we are witnessing may be a temporary response to a familiar scent. It tells us nothing reliable about his long-term stability. I will not have a civilian injured on this base. Kennel masters, tighten the poles and clear the floor." "Mr. Price." The voice came from Taggart. He was standing with the coffee cup set down and his hands at his sides, but something in his face had reorganized itself entirely. The cool, proprietary assessment was gone. In its place was the expression of a man who has just remembered something he has spent years trying not to think about too directly. "The bid is at $5,000, Taggart said. "I am raising it. Meridian Group bids $50,000 for Lot 7. The room erupted. Even Sutton blinked. Price recovered first. He was a professional, and professionalism is often the thing that reasserts itself when everything else gives way. "Mr. Taggart," the Colonel's directive. "Is not a directive," Taggart said. His voice was not loud, but it was final in the way that certain kinds of quiet are final. "It's a request. The bidding is active and the asset is D&D surplus. $50,000. He reached into his inside jacket pocket and produced an authorization card. He walked to the podium and set it down without ceremony. "That's the corporate credit authorization. You'll have the transfer documents within the hour." He turned and walked toward the center of the floor, moving slowly, hands visible at his sides, the way someone approaches an animal they do not want to startle. He stopped 6 feet from Joelle and Arrow. He crouched down, not kneeling, just low enough to speak at her level. Arrow turned his head and looked at Taggart. He did not growl. "I did 2 tours as a regular force infantry officer before I went private sector," Taggart said quietly. "Second tour was Kandahar, 2009. Our patrol ran into a contact near Panjwai district. 3 of us were cut off on a rooftop, and the extraction had already pulled back. The sergeant who came back for us wasn't part of our unit. He was attached on a joint training exchange. He went in twice before the wall came down enough to make a 3rd run impossible." He paused. His voice was steady, but it was the steadiness of something held, not the steadiness of something easy. "I was in a field hospital for 6 days. By the time I was transferred, the exchange unit had rotated out. I never got his name through official channels, just his face and the name tape on his jacket. I looked for him for years, never found a record of an exchange attachment that matched the date and the unit." He looked directly at Joelle. "Your father's name tape." Joelle made a sound that was not quite a word and not quite a breath. Taggart reached into his jacket pocket and produced the carbon receipt that Price had already begun processing. He set it on the floor in front of Joelle, the way you would set something down for an animal you did not want to alarm. "Your $50 is accepted," he said. "Consider the rest a debt I've carried for 17 years. He belongs with you. I think he's always known that." The applause, when it came, did not build. It arrived all at once. Men who had come to a military asset disposal auction were clapping in the particular way that people do when something reorganizes, briefly, their understanding of what the world is capable of. Procurement officers, corrections officials, kennel masters with their hands finally loose at their sides. Along the north wall of the hangar, all 12 military working dogs remained sitting in perfect, silent attention, facing the center aisle, for a full 3 minutes after Taggart walked away. No handler had commanded it. No release order was given. They simply sat and watched, and eventually, one by one in their own time, went back to being dogs. Arrow did not enter the house for 16 days. He accepted the backyard without apparent resentment. He tolerated Joelle's presence within it. He allowed her to bring him food and ate it reliably after she walked back inside, and she was experienced enough with traumatized animals to understand that this was not rejection. It was negotiation. It was the careful, incremental calculus of an animal deciding whether a new place was safe enough to lower its guard in. Joelle's mother, Diane Picard, watched from the kitchen window with the expression of a woman who has already survived one devastating loss and is not emotionally equipped to absorb another. She had said very little when Joelle arrived home with Arrow in the back seat of her hatchback, only, "He's big," and then, after a moment, Marc would be relieved. On the evenings after work, Joelle would take Marc's jacket and go sit on the back step. She didn't attempt to call Arrow over or initiate contact. She sat with a mug of tea and sometimes talked aloud. About her day at the clinic, about a patient she'd treated, about a memory of Marc that had surfaced on her morning commute. The Sunday mornings when he made breakfast moving around the kitchen in exactly the same sequence every time, without variation, coffee first, then eggs, then the radio on low, with the systematic calm of someone who understood that routine is its own kind of armor. Arrow would lie at the far end of the yard and watch her. His ears stayed forward. Gradually, over those 16 days, the distance between them closed. Not because he moved toward her, but because he chose, each evening, to start a little less far away. On the 17th night, a winter storm rolled in off the Ottawa Valley without much warning. The thunder arrived in low, structural concussions that shook the window frames, and Joelle, at her kitchen table, looked up to find Arrow pressed against the back door from the outside, trembling so violently she could see it through the glass. His eyes, when they found hers through the pane, carried the particular expression of an animal experiencing something that has nothing to do with the present moment, and everything to do with a sound it heard once, very far away on a Tuesday morning in March. She opened the door, stepped outside into the cold and the rain without stopping for a coat. She took Marc's field jacket and draped it over Arrow's shaking shoulders, laid it across him the way you'd put a blanket on a child in a bad dream. Then she wrapped both arms around his neck, there in the downpour, and said the only thing she could think of that was true and solid and his. "On your 6, Arrow. Dad always said that. You're not alone. I'm on your 6. The trembling didn't stop all at once. It left the way fear leaves a body when it finally decides to believe it's safe, reluctantly in slow stages, starting at the edges. But it did stop. Arrow stood up. He turned, nudged the sliding glass door open with his nose, and walked through the kitchen without stopping. He went directly down the hallway to Joelle's bedroom. He circled once, lay down at the foot of her bed, pressed his chin against the floor, and let out a breath that seemed to carry the accumulated weight of 9 months of a grief that had had nowhere to go. From that night forward, Arrow did not sleep outside again. He was at the front door in the morning when Joelle left for work, and at the window when she pulled into the driveway every afternoon. He learned the rhythms of the household with the focused, methodical intelligence of a dog trained to catalogue the world around him. He appointed himself to Diane Picard in the evenings without being asked, positioning his large, warm body against her feet while she watched television, as though he had independently determined that she also needed someone on her 6. Diane stopped watching from the kitchen window with that particular expression after about 2 weeks. She started leaving the back door unlocked instead. The following August, on the anniversary of the Mali deployment's departure date, not the date Marc died, but the date he had left, because that was the last time Joelle had physically seen him, she drove to Ottawa with Arrow in the back seat. Beechwood National Military Cemetery lay at the eastern edge of the city in the quiet of mature trees and white stone markers that extended in their rows with the orderliness of a unit at rest. Joelle had visited twice since the funeral, alone. This was Arrow's first time. She clipped his leash and let him set the pace. He walked slowly, nose low, reading the grass and the stone, and the warm August air in the long, deliberate sweeps she recognized from what Marc had once explained to her about scent work. Not random, he'd said, over coffee at the kitchen table. Not by what's loudest, by what the wind prioritizes. Arrow was following something she could not perceive. She could feel it in the tension of the leash, a directionality, a purpose that was not hers. He was not walking toward Marc's section. Marc was buried in the north quadrant. Arrow was pulling steadily south, toward a row of markers Joelle didn't immediately recognize. She followed him. He stopped in front of a white marble headstone in the second-to-last row. He sat sharply, perfectly straight in the formal military K9 position she had seen in Marc's photographs. Chest square, ears vertical, the posture of a dog reporting for duty. Then he raised his right paw and placed it carefully against the base of the stone. Joelle leaned forward and read the name. Corporal Tessa Bain, Royal Canadian Medical Service, 24 years old. Joelle stood very still. Tessa Bain had been the combat medic assigned to Marc's patrol on the morning in March. She had been the first to reach Marc after the secondary detonation. She had worked on him for 11 minutes under fire before the evacuation became mandatory. She had been loaded onto the same helicopter as Marc's body and died of her wounds at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany 19 days later. Joelle had seen her name in the casualty assistance documents. She had not known Tessa was buried here. She had not known, and somehow Arrow had. He hadn't just remembered Marc. He had remembered everyone who had been there. He had remembered the young medic who had refused to leave Marc's side, who had done everything a human being could do with the time and the tools available to her, and who had not come home either. He had carried that knowledge through 9 months of grief and sedation, and concrete kennels, and a hangar full of strangers, and he had brought it here, intact, to lay it at the foot of a stone that no one in the Mitchell family had visited. Arrow kept his paw on the stone for a long time. Joelle didn't hurry him. She crouched beside him, one hand resting lightly on his flank, and let him have whatever this was, this act of witness that existed entirely outside the reach of language. She thought about what Marc had said once, during a conversation about why Arrow was different from other dogs. Because he takes the pack seriously, Marc had said, he doesn't see a job. He sees people he's responsible for. That's not the same thing at all. Eventually, Arrow lowered his paw. He turned and looked up at her, and she had worked with enough animals to understand what a dog's eyes communicate when they are expressing something that falls entirely outside the normal register of want and hunger and play. He led her, unhurried, 3 rows north and 2 rows east, to Marc Picard's headstone. He didn't sit sharply to attention this time. He didn't howl. He simply lay down beside the stone, stretched out on his side in the warm August grass, and closed his eyes, not the alert, scanning vigil of a working dog, but the deep, settled quiet of an animal that has completed what it came here to do. Joelle sat down beside him, her back against the cool marble, her hand resting on his flank so she could feel him breathe. She was wearing the field jacket. In the breast pocket, folded in 3, was the $50 bill. Someone in a veterans Facebook group had offered $250 for it after the story circulated through military networks and eventually found its way online. She had declined without having to think about it. Some things are worth more than what they can be exchanged for. Marc had understood that. Arrow had understood it longer than any of them could know. And there, in the August stillness of Beechwood, with a healed dog breathing steadily against her side, and a long row of white stones catching the last of the morning light, and Joelle finally understood it too, not as a lesson, but as a fact she had always known in the place where knowledge lives before it has words. The pack had held, and the line had been held by the one person no one in that hangar had seen coming. A 26-year-old vet tech from Pembroke, Ontario, with a $50 bill and her father's jacket, and the kind of stubborn, quiet love that turns out to be the only thing grief, in the end, cannot outlast.